muscles get their energy? How do they, how different muscle fiber types use energy differently? How do they get the ATP that they need? There are different mechanisms by which muscle can do that. And so we're going to appreciate the unique metabolic demands of skeletal muscle and how these demands can change with different types of muscle. All right. We'll talk about how cells generate ATP, and then later on, we'll look at the different fiber types and how those different fiber types use ATP or generate ATP differently. Okay, now muscle cells have to generate ATP. It's the currency that we know all cells need to do work. And it is even more important for muscles to do all of that physical contracting. That's why muscles have so much mitochondria, because they need quite a bit of ATP to bring about cross-bridge cycling. So ATP is what drives cross-bridge cycling. Can anyone remember specifically where this ATP is used? Just from our knowledge of our conversation of cross-bridge cycling, what is the exact role of that ATP in cross-bridge cycling?
Doesn't ATP release the myosin head from the actin?
Yes, absolutely correct. Thank you. Absolutely correct. So ATP is going to be needed to release that. A new ATP has to come in to release that myosin interaction with actin and bring myosin, back to its low energy form, where that can then be hydrolyzed and then converted to its high energy form. So that ATP is needed intimately to drive the cross-bridge cycling in terms of that interaction. Now, the mechanism by which we make ATP is going to differ depending on the type of work that that muscle is doing, and that's what we're going to be speaking about here today. Now, there are three sources of ATP. We can have ATP made through three different mechanisms. There is phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate using the enzyme creatine kinase, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a transient or temporary mechanism of ATP. This is not sustainable. This is only used temporarily while the other two processes that I'm going to speak about now get warmed up. So the phosphorylation of ADP via creatine kinase is not a sustainable mechanism of ATP generation. The other two mechanisms are, one is oxidative phosphorylation of ADP in the mitochondria. This we would have talked at length about when we look at cellular respiration. We looked at how much more ATP was generated by the electron transport chain. So just looking at the schematic here on the right, all the way down here at the final steps of cellular respiration, we have all of our electrons being shuttled off into the mitochondria, playing their role in the electron transport chain, and 32 to 34 of our 38 ATP are generated here via oxidative phosphorylation. So that's going to be more of a sustainable mechanism for ATP generation for muscle contraction. And then the other mechanism is something, again, we already touched on in cellular respiration, but it's in glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis generated 2 net ATP per molecule of glucose. And so that ATP production up here can also be a more sustainable means of ATP production to facilitate muscle contraction. So glycolysis, anaerobic glycolysis, that is, because oxygen is not present. So this is anaerobic. Is one of those more sustainable processes. And then oxidative phosphorylation, which requires oxygen, is another more sustainable mechanism, whereas this creatine phosphate system is just a transient kind of holdover until these two more sustainable processes are ready and warmed up. So let's talk about the creatine phosphate system here, and then next time we'll get into the other two processes. So the role of creatine in the creatine phosphate system is to provide a transient, temporary, small amount of ATP that is released very quickly as the other sustainable processes get warmed up. So essentially, muscles need to be very nimble in their response, right? If you think to move, if you think to jump, walk, talk, scream, whatever it is you do with muscles, it needs to be an immediate response. And so there's not this time that is available for oxidative phosphorylation to get going, for anaerobic glycolysis to get going. And so we need a temporary means of having ATP ready to go when that muscle calls on it for contraction. And that is where this system comes into place. So the reaction here that we're seeing is showing how this is catalyzed. So we go from creatine phosphate and ADP here on the left under the influence of the enzyme creatine kinase. So creatine kinase catalyzes this conversion back and forth, right? That's what these bidirectional arrows means, that we can go from either end to the other. And that gives us creatine and ATP, which is what we can use to sustain our muscle contraction temporarily while other things get going. Now, this is going to follow the law of mass action. So if I have a lot of ATP around, I'm going to drive my reaction to the left, and I'm going to make more creatine phosphate. If I have a lot of ADP around, let's say my muscle is using up that ATP, leaving more ADP every time that myosin head kicks off an ADP, I'm building up more ADP on this end, then I'm going to drive my reaction to the right and make some more ATP to help to sustain that muscle contraction. So depending on which of our substrates we have more of, that will determine the direction that we are converting, whether we're going towards products or reactants with the help of creatine kinase. Now, when we use up ATP, as I mentioned earlier, we generate more ADP and we drive our reaction towards the right. But then at the end of our muscle contraction, at the end of this creatine phosphate system, or at the end of the need for this creatine phosphate system, we have our other processes that start warming up. So oxidative phosphorylation gets going, anaerobic glycolysis gets going, and we start to make more of this ATP. And so that's going to drive our reaction back towards creatine phosphate, and we're going to keep that sitting on tap for when we have another muscle contraction that needs to use this transient source of ATP. So essentially, when the other processes get going, we're going to drive our reaction towards creatine phosphate, and that is going to be sitting ready, waiting to go until we have another reaction that requires this transient source of energy. Now, this can only provide a small amount of ATP, but it is enough to sustain 5 times the quantity of resting muscle. So it's not going to be enough to jog a mile or to do really strenuous activity, but it can do 5 times what the muscle needs for its state at rest, which is just enough to kind of get it going while other processes are getting warmed up. Okay, and this is, by the way, why bodybuilders typically supplement creatine as a part of their workout supplementation. It is theorized, it is thought that if we supplement creatine, we can actually tap into this process more and have more ATP ready for muscles to generate more contraction. So that is thought to give more performance in the gym, more of this energy reserve for muscle. And so bodybuilders typically supplement creatine as a way to rely more on this pathway to give more of that muscle performance for lifting and running and that sort of thing.